Good morning. It's wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much for having me. It has been a pleasure the last few days to hang out with your pastor and with Megan as well. And we've loved seeing your beautiful city and even a little bit beyond the city. We got to go to Antigua, which is a magical place for us to visit. Very different than where we're from. And coming here from Norway, very different weather. Right now in Norway, it's cold and wet, which is pretty much how it is 12 months of the year. So it's nice to get some sunshine and to be with you here. I appreciate Mark inviting me to share with you today. And as Mark said, I want to talk about the global impact of the International Church. The International Church has been a part of my life since I was 3 years old, and my family moved to the Netherlands, or Holland as it's often called, and we didn't speak Dutch. And so we found ourselves in an English-speaking church with other people from around the world. And from then on, I moved to Norway after that. And so I've spent most of my life in international churches. And I just believe that God is using international churches in incredible ways today to impact the world like never before. I believe the international church is really one of the greatest, if not the greatest tool we have for mission engagement in the world today. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that today because I'm excited about what God is doing here through the Union Church of Guatemala. Now we're going to see, our clicker is working. I want to start with a story. Last summer, my family went to New York to drop our oldest off at university and to take a road trip from New York all the way to Texas and to visit friends and family along the way. It was, a couple thousand miles, a couple of weeks it took us. And there's a lot of roads where you just drive and drive and drive in America. And so as we're driving along, I get bored at one point, and I start looking at all the menus. And in the menu, I find one that says auto steering. And I think, could that mean what it sounds like? So I turn it on, and I can tell the steering wheel seems to be kind of moving on its own. And so as we're going, I just kind of barely let go of it, and the car starts to drift, and then it straightens up, and it centers in the lane. And I grab the steering wheel again. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, it works, but who could ever trust a car to drive for them, right? But then we're coming up to this turn on the freeway, and I think, could it really do a whole turn? So I let go just a little bit, and as we come to the turn, it steers through the turn. And I grab it again, and I think, wow, it really can do this, but there's no way I could ever trust a car to drive for me. But within about 10 minutes, I'm reading a book and talking to the kids in the back, and the car is driving on its own. And I kid you not, most of the rest of the trip, I did not drive, or I didn't steer. The car even could auto brake and auto accelerate. It was really incredible. The point of pain for me came about 10 minutes later after I'd finally put my faith in this car. And my younger daughter, who's 15, she says, "Dad, this is the best driving you've ever done on a road trip." I would have argued with her, but my wife kind of agreed, and so I just gave up. But the point is, so often we have a desire to stay in control because we think we can do it better. And when we let go of that wheel, and don't try this in your cars if you don't have auto steering, but when we let go of that wheel in that Toyota we were driving, we found that it could drive even better than I could. It was able to stay centered, to take the curves. It would detect when a car slowed down in front of it. It would keep its distance. And in the same way in our spiritual lives, so often we don't want to let go of the wheel. And yet God has a plan for us, and He's better at directing it than we are. And that doesn't just go for us as individuals, it also goes for us as a community. The God, I believe, has a plan for each church and a desire for it. And sometimes we are too afraid to just let God do with our church even what He wants because it's scary. Following God, frankly, is always scary. If you don't find... Let's look in the Bible. If we think about the disciples, didn't they kind of go from fear to amazement? Right? Oh my goodness, we're going to drown in the storm. And Jesus is like, storm, calm down. Whoa, He can control the weather. And then they're like, oh no, we can't feed the people. They're all going to be angry. Oh, wow, He can feed the people. Fear and amazement, fear and amazement. If your spiritual walk isn't like that, then maybe you're not attempting for God the things He's calling you to. Because I think even for our churches, there's an amount of fear. There should be not fear as in an ungodly fear, but this, oh my goodness, God's calling us to do what? We can't do that on our own. And God says, exactly. He wants to take us to a place that it takes that faith so we can be amazed at the things God can do. Now, just a little bit more background. This is where I come from. Okay, I don't actually live on that mountain, but it's a beautiful country, Norway. This is very close to my house. It's the most famous hike in Norway. It's called Pulpit Rock. It's a good one for a pastor. So when Mark, you come visit, we'll go up there. You can preach. So Pulpit Rock there, here's another view of it. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's on Lisa Fjord. And yeah, about 45 minutes from our house, you can start this hike. Now, it's a hike that would take, well, it depends on where you're from. It could take an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on how often you hike, just to get up there. But it's gorgeous views. But just above this site are these piles of rocks. So Pulpit Rock is just below the ridge there. And many people, they'll take a rock from down at the bottom when they start the trail, and they'll carry the rock with them, and they'll place the rock at the top. And then, of course, they go down. There's another trail that takes you back down to the parking lot where you left your car. They do this because it's tradition, but it's also a way of remembering how far you've come and kind of showing, hey, I've been here. Look, we came from way down here. I made it to the top. But you don't do it to stay there. You do it with the mind that I still have to get back to my car before the sun sets, which is not till 1 a.m., so you have plenty of time. But you want to get back down and get home safely. And I think in our international churches, we need to take into account these 3 ideas that we do when we hike in Norway. One is we're mindful of the past. We know where we've come from, and that's important. What God has done in the past is often somewhat predictive of where He's taking us in the future. And so that rock reminds us of where we've come from. And then we're active in the present while we're mindful of the future. But before I go into those 2, let me just talk about the past. I want to take you way back just for a minute, because I found your church in the book of Isaiah. This is kind of going way back in the past. But here we have Isaiah chapter 66, verses 18 through 21. And I, because of what they have planned and done, am about to come and gather the people of all nations and languages, and they will come and see my glory. So back in Isaiah, God is prophesying through Isaiah that there is a time coming when He's going to gather all the nations, all the languages to Himself. He says, I will set a sign among them, and I will send some of those who survive to the nations, to Tarshish, to the Libyans and Lydians, famous as archers, to Tubal in Greece, and to the distant islands that have not heard of my fame or seen my glory. They will proclaim my glory among the nations. And he goes on, and they will bring all your people from all the nations to my holy mountain in Jerusalem as an offering to the Lord. Now, I don't think this literally means to Jerusalem. I think that the holy mountain of Jerusalem represented the Lord's presence. And the idea here is all the nations will be brought into God's presence. And it goes on partway through, it says, they will bring them as the Israelites bring their grain offerings to the temple of the Lord in ceremonially clean vessels, and I will select some of them also to be priests and Levites. You see, here where Isaiah is prophesying, I believe we see a picture of what God is doing through the international church today. God says, I'll bring the nations, and out of them, some I'll even choose to be priests and Levites, religious leaders. Now, at the time, you had to be a part of the tribe of Levi. If you were a priest in the line of Aaron, you definitely had to be Jewish. But Mark, are you Jewish? Okay, Mark's not, I'm not. God has called many of us who are from other nations to be a part of leading people before God and into His presence. That's a picture of what God's doing through the international church. God said there's a day coming, I'm going to bring them together. They're going to be in my glory. They're going to be in my presence together like we are this morning. I believe we're living in a time of fulfilled prophecy. I believe that we're seeing what God is doing, and we're going to continue seeing this until Christ returns. But we're a part of this. Isaiah, when he prophesied, it was hundreds of years later, and then we have Jesus come, we have the destruction of the temple, and it's not until Acts chapter 11, that we're going to look at in just a minute, that we begin to see those nations drawn together. But we see that almost 2,000 years ago, and we are still experiencing it today in the international church. And that to me is very, very exciting. So we want to be mindful of the past, aware of how God's prophecy in Isaiah said that He is for all nations and all languages. how he's going to bring us together and he's going to bring religious leaders out of it. He's going to call people from this church to later be pastors and leaders, even in other international churches. But we also want to be active in the present. We can't live in the past. We can't look at what God did. My church is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. It has a rich history since 1973. But we can't look at all the things God did in the past and just live there and say, well, I think we've done enough. Look at all these things we can be proud of. We have to be active where God has us today. You all also have a rich history. I've gotten to hear some of that this week. I actually got to meet one of your past pastors, Carl, when I was in Delhi in November. I mean, so God, the history that he has given this church, Union Church of Guatemala, it has spread around the world. You guys have had an impact in other countries, even though you may not have realized it. But you all are active here. You're building that tower. You're doing what God has called you to do today. But we can't be stuck only in what we're doing today. We have to be thinking about the future. We can't stay there on top of the mountain all the time. It's beautiful, but it's not a very good place to live. So God calls us, even as we're active now, to be mindful of the future. But the problem is so often we get very comfortable. We like what we're doing in the present. We say, oh, I get it, this works. We like to do the same thing the same way every time. But God, he's creative. God likes to do a new thing. God likes to do things differently. God doesn't change. His word doesn't change, but he likes to do it differently. Right? I mean, we see this throughout Scripture. One time Moses hits the rock. The next time God says, how about you talk to the rock this time? But Moses, he doesn't want to talk to the rock, so he just hits it again. Because we want to live in that place of comfort. We want to say, I know when I hit the rock, it works. I just want to keep doing what I know works. And God says, no, it's not about what you know works. It's about following me. That's what works. It's about a living relationship with a living God who is ongoing, still creating. Not creating as in out of nothing ex nihilo in the beginning, but he is still a creative God. He is still coming with new ways and new things for us to do and to participate with him in. And so often we limit ourselves because we go, I saw God work one time this way and I'm going to keep doing this. And God's saying, but that was yesterday. Let's do something new today. So he wants us to be, while we're active and we do whatever he's called us to do now, we're mindful of the future. Okay, we're focused on the future. Where is he calling us next? How does he want us to change what we're doing today to be ready for the future? So we're mindful of the past, we're active in the present, but we're focused on the future. God has a future for this church. You don't know what it is. None of you here, I don't think, know the future. But God does. And how often we don't ask God to tell us even, hey, what's going to happen in the future? I heard a story recently. How many of you know Chick-fil-A? A few of you. Chick-fil-A is God's favorite fried chicken restaurant. I'm pretty sure. A friend of mine goes to church with one of the owners of Chick-fil-A. And during the pandemic, my friend, his name's Richard, he went and he talked to Bubba, Bubba Cathy. And it's Dan's brother. Dan's the CEO, and Bubba's one of the owners. And he said, Bubba, how are you doing? You know, all of your stores are closed. Are you guys doing okay? Bubba said, we are doing great. He said 2 years ago, before the pandemic, we prayed, because they're believers, and we prayed and said, God, what should we do with Chick-fil-A? Now, how many people, when you've got a successful business, it's one of the most successful fast food chains in America, decides to pray? But they said, everything's going great, but let's just pray and ask God what we should do. And he said, and God told us to expand our drive-thrus. I kid you not. And he said, we didn't know why. Things were going great. We didn't see a need. But we literally tore down some of our restaurants and rebuilt them in place because they didn't have room for adequate drive-thrus. And we wouldn't have 2 drive-thrus. And so we did all this because God told us to. We finished that, and then the pandemic hit. Our stores had to be closed, but drive-thrus were allowed to be open. And in the first 6 months or so of the pandemic, they had the highest sales they had ever had. Because God knew it was coming. And I think so often, if we think we've got it under control, we just continue doing it the same way every time until we have a problem, until we hit a Red Sea or a Jericho. Then we go, okay, God, now what do I do? And God would like it if we came to him before we got to that point, because he knows it's coming. And he could tell us ahead of time how we prepare. See, so often we get to that point where we have the sense that God wants us to take us to the next level, but we don't know how to get there. The wonderful thing is God does, and he wants us at that point, but he wants us always at that point of dependency. Every time we think we know how to get to the next level, we're likely missing out on what God's best is for us, because he wants this to be a journey with him, where he's going to take us through that place that we don't know how. When we reach the end of ourselves, we're at the place God wants us to be. Unfortunately, often we give up. Often we go back to what we know. And what I found is a faulty memory equals a faulty faith, because we forget how God came through for us the last time. This was Israel over and over again. God sends the plagues. God parts the Red Sea. And then they're out in the wilderness. We're thirsty. We should go back to Egypt. It's like, how have they forgotten what God had done for them over and over? And God reminds them to remember the things he has done. And so we have to look, and we look at our history, again, we're mindful of the past. We see, how has God come through for Union Church before? How has God come through in your own life? And if we've seen that he's trustworthy, then the next time there's a barrier, there's a problem, there's an obstacle, we say, okay, but I know what God did before. This isn't too big for God. It's too big for me, but it's not too big for God. And so we see that God, one of the great ways that he has worked over the years and overcome one of the big obstacles has been through the international church. Because one of the big obstacles was the early Christians, they really didn't want to share the gospel outside of their people group. There was a bit of xenophobia. There was a bit of fear of the other. Not only in Jerusalem, but even beyond Jerusalem, they would go and they would only start churches with Jewish people. And that begins to change in Acts chapter 11. And here I believe we have the origin of the international church. So while Isaiah is prophesying about a day coming, and I'm not saying that only applies to the international church, but I think we're definitely a part of that fulfillment of prophecy. But we see hundreds of years later in Acts 11, the birth of the international church. So I'd like to read with you a few verses here. It says, "Now those who had been scattered by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, spreading the word only among Jews, only among their own people. We all have a tendency to gravitate to our own people groups. But God has a heart for all nations, for all people. With God, there's no Guatemalan and no American and no Norwegian and there's no Venezuelan. With God, there's only his people that he loves. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks also." Now, in some translations, it'll talk about the Hellenists here. And you might be thinking, well, in Acts 6, wasn't there an issue with the Hellenists, the Greek-speaking Jews? And there was. The difference in Acts 6 is it's all Jewish people. Some speak, really Aramaic most likely. They might have understood Hebrew. Others only spoke Greek. You're probably familiar with this in Guatemala, that if you have Guatemalans who leave the country and raise a family outside the country, often the kids don't speak Spanish or the local tribal language. Does that happen here? This happens in a lot of other countries I've been to, where the family will come back and the second generation, they don't quite fit in anymore. Well, this was happening with the Jewish population. They, for economic reasons, they had left Israel, and often the second, the third generation, they still identified as Jewish, but they couldn't speak the local language, Aramaic. And so those Greek speakers were in Jerusalem as well, and that's who they had been witnessing to. But now they're actually speaking to the Greeks, to the pagans. These people had no Jewish roots. They're telling them about the good news about the Lord Jesus. The Lord's hand was with them, and a great number of people believed and turned to the Lord. News of this reached the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. Now, I would like to think that they said, oh, this is great, let's send Barnabas to encourage them. I don't think that's what's happening at all. I think the leaders in Jerusalem went, uh-oh, what's going on? This sounds a little edgy. It's not what we're used to. It's not the same thing. We've been doing the same way. Barnabas, we trust you. Go check this out. Because let's look at the next verse. When he arrived and saw what the grace of God had done, he was glad and encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. You see, it seems like he came inspecting, and then he saw, oh, wait, this is of God. There's nothing to worry about. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. Now, you all know Saul, the Apostle Paul, yet he is back home in Tarsus. Why? Why is he not out doing ministry? And there's probably a number of reasons we could look at, but one, I don't think he was so welcome in Jerusalem. Here's a terrorist who was bringing about the murder of Stephen and arresting other Christians. But the international church is a place where even those who are rejected by others are welcomed into the faith. Even those who have histories that are so sordid, that are so evil, that many other people would say, I can never be friends with you. I can never forgive you what you've done. In the international church, they find forgiveness and they find grace. And so Saul is now brought into the international church where he is welcomed in a way that I don't believe he was welcomed before. Now we can't read, there's one more bit here. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. Now this is really important. I know the word Christian is not always helpful depending on what part of the world we're in today. But the idea here is these are people from all over the land, different nationalities, different languages, and we'll see that in a second. And yet they identified as one. So I don't want to be Jewish and you be Greek and you be a Cypriot and you be from Libya and you be from and all these things we've heard about back like in Isaiah, all those nations in the area. So they just said, we're Christians. We're brothers and sisters. We are one people and we are one nationality under the kingdom of Jesus. We're citizens of his kingdom. So it was in the international church that first that unity was birthed. Isn't that beautiful? What's crazy to me is very often in international churches, like here at your church, there's more unity than we have in homogenous churches back in our home countries. Because God just does a special work where he brings us together, even though we come from such different places and backgrounds, and yet we find that unity where we can go by one name. Doesn't mean we agree on everything. It doesn't mean we're exactly the same. By no means. It's not uniformity. It's unity in the midst of diversity. Now, we're going to have to skip ahead because Mark said I can't preach for 2 hours. So, we're going to skip just to chapter 13. We're still talking about the same church. Now, in the church of Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. Barnabas, we knew he was there. Simeon, called Niger. Now, Niger literally means black. So Simeon was a black man, probably from somewhere in North Africa. The Bible is showing us the diversity in the leadership now. Not just in the congregation, but the leadership is not just the Jews. Unlike in Jerusalem where the apostles kind of held on to that top leadership, and I'm not saying they shouldn't have at the beginning, but here we have this international church where the leadership is diverse. Lucius is from Cyrene. Manaen had been brought up with Herod. That's like for us in Norway if somebody had been raised with Putin. We border Russia. They might not feel the most welcome in some churches, but in the international church, they're welcome despite, it doesn't matter who they know, who they were friends with. We're here to follow Jesus. And then, of course, our famous terrorist, Saul of Tarsus, who we call Paul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. It's a beautiful thing that international churches are by nature sending churches. We are churches that are always sending, sometimes because your job takes you somewhere, sometimes because someone feels called to leave and to go. But from the very beginning, international churches, they were places of unity, diversity. They were sending people. They were even collecting money, and Paul would go and collect money and take it back to Jerusalem for those in need to support. It's incredible to see this history that we have. For 2,000 years now, international churches have existed in some shape or form. Now, the Missional International Church Network that I lead, we start and strengthen international churches. I won't take the time to go through all of our core values, but I do have some flyers here. And so if you want to pick one up from me afterwards, you can read those. A little bit of explanation there. We see that there is a similarity today that Paul had in that early time as he began to plant churches across the Roman Empire. Paul had the Roman roads. It allowed for easy access. Today, if you go to Greece, for example, you can still find the road where Paul went from Philippi to Thessaloniki. It runs right by the highway as you're driving between the two cities. Today, we have airplanes where I can get to Guatemala. It was 24 hours door to door, but that's still pretty fast compared to what it used to be. And it's pretty cheap compared to what it used to be. Paul had the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Rome had conquered the world, at least the known world, that part, and so there was peace there. We've got the United Nations, we've got NATO. Yes, there's still war in the world, I'm well aware of that, but there's more peace now than there's ever been. It's quite easy for us to go to 90% of the countries in the world and to get in and to visit and to have jobs there and businesses and diplomats. And lastly, we have, that's hello in Greek, they had a common trade language of Greek across the Roman world. We have English. Now, not every international church uses English, but 98% do. We do have international churches that are using German, that are using French, that are using Spanish. Many do translation, but most have at least English as a core language because it's been the language in the last 100 years of business and diplomacy. And so because of that, we're in this amazing opportune time for international churches to have a greater impact than ever before. The MICN, we do a number of things. We do gatherings. We help raise money for churches. We help support them in finding pastors. We help support the pastors and the leaders. This next week, tomorrow morning, Scotty and I and Mark are going to fly out to Costa Rica, where we're having our annual retreat for the Americas. So pastors will come from Argentina, from Bolivia, from different parts, and we're going to be doing a course on Jesus, on leadership, and just taking time to fellowship together to encourage these pastors. The great thing about Mark being there is not only do we hopefully encourage him, I know that he's a huge encouragement to the other pastors. So in this way, not only are you being served as a church because we want to keep your pastor refreshed, but you're also serving. Because there may be a pastor who comes who's at his wit's end, and it may be that Mark's the one who can connect with him and encourage him to stay in the fight. And so these are important opportunities. In the fall, we have our global gathering. Now, that was last year's in Bangkok. This year, it's going to be in Kusadasi, Turkey, next to Ephesus. We'll do a tour of Ephesus. We've got people from different parts of the world coming. Edmund Chan is from Singapore. We've got Nikki Gumbel doing videos from the UK. And we've got a leadership expert from the US. So we're big on multicultural voices because we know that we have multicultural leadership in our churches. And so these are ways that MICN is trying to support the work. But what's more exciting than the network is the individual churches. So I just want to tell you a few quick stories to encourage you about sister churches in the network. So this is Argentina, Buenos Aires. The church there, one of the churches there, recently rediscovered their history. We're mindful of the past. This church was planting churches into Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru in 1857 to 1889. The pastor found this out, and his name's Werner. Mark knows him as well. And Werner was feeling called to re-engage across the Americas. And then we found this, and he was like, wow, this is part of God's calling on our church. Now, I believe just like individuals are called to ministry, that God calls a church. Now, it may change over time. My calling could change from one church to another ministry. Your calling may change from Sunday school to outreach or whatever God may call you to individually. But I also believe as a community, God has a call for us. And this church has felt called to plant and to oversee this area. And Werner is serving as the regional coordinator. But he was already doing that before we knew this. It's cool to see how God's anointing works in this. And so their church, they're reaching out. Werner's heart is for all the international churches. We're trying to find ways to help them with funding issues, help them with other special areas and things they deal with in Latin America that's different than Europe and Africa and Asia for our other churches. But let's go over to Asia. This is Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. There, the church felt called to start Love Hanoi, where they began to pick up litter, help street children, helped prostitutes out of prostitution. Through their work, they began to network with other churches, many of them local churches, many of them underground. When they started, they weren't even a legal church there. Through their work, God has opened the door that they're now a legal body, and they've seen over 4,000 Vietnamese come to Christ. Their calling is different than Buenos Aires. Their calling was to serve their city. They have seen such a huge impact from that. They've also been given legal status. They know the mayor now. It's incredible how God has given them favor as they followed God's call. But like I said, the way God does it in Buenos Aires and Hanoi is different. We've got a new church starting up in Paris. This church, actually, the church has been around for a while. They're a French-speaking international church, but they're starting an English congregation. Within 4 weeks, they had 800 people at it. So it's been growing like crazy. This is the building. What's neat about this building is they felt called to serve their community by building a convention center. They rent out rooms to businesses and to community events, and they make money doing that to help fund the church. But it also means their church has become a hub of Créteil, which is a suburb southeast of Paris. Through that, God is opening up doors for them to reach the community. Now, inside the church, it's huge. It's a little different. There's a 360-degree screen, so it's the only time I've ever been seasick at church. It's an incredible experience there of what they're doing. But it's different. What they're doing wouldn't work in Norway for us. But there in Paris, a hub for Europe, people come in for meetings. They need a convention center. The church is doing, and by the way, the government even contributed over €1 million to help build that facility because they saw the need. What's really cool about that, just a side story, the mayor of Créteil had said before, I will never have a cathedral in my city. He's very anti-God. He ended up approving €1 million to go to this convention center. And he came and he spoke. I was there. He spoke at the opening. And he said, I said there would never be a cathedral, but I was wrong. See, God's softening hearts through the international church. We have a church in Phuket, Thailand. They have a different strategy. They're trying to start an international school that will reach many of the Thai people. The Thai families, they want their kids to go to an international school so they have opportunities in the future. They're getting accredited. Here's a better picture of Phuket. It's not really just that little island. They're getting accredited through Canada. And they're also getting IGCSE accreditation, which is Cambridge. This will allow students that go through their program to go to university anywhere in the world. The really neat thing about this is the Canadian accreditation requires religious teaching, which means they're going to be doing Alpha course for all of their kids, teach them about Christianity. They're pairing this with their international church so that as those kids come to know Christ, they can come into their church. It's in English, but the kids want to learn English. The families do because they want to send their kids out of Thailand to university where they can hopefully get good jobs and send money home. And so the church is planting a school while planting a church. So my point is God has so many different ways of working through international churches. And I don't know exactly what God has for Union Church of Guatemala. What I do know is He knows the future. I know He has a plan. I know it's unique. I also know that while we do this individually, that God at the same time calls us to be in community. It's like trees of the forest. Each tree is unique, each one's individual, but yet they're connected. As a matter of fact, there was a German researcher recently. I read this in, was it National Geographic? It was Smithsonian Magazine. And it was a German researcher. He found a stump. It wasn't really this one, but he found a stump in the forest in Germany, down in the southern Germany, in Bavaria. And the stump had life coming out of it, it kept trying to grow. And he couldn't figure it out because it had no leaves, and the canopy had grown over it from other trees, so there was no way for it to get light. So it was like there was no way for it to get nutrition. How was the stump that had been cut down decades ago? He could tell how it was decades ago it was cut down. How is it still alive? And through his research, what he found out was the roots from the other trees had connected, and the other trees were feeding this stump, keeping it alive. And it's a beautiful picture to me of what we do with MICN, that it's all about the churches, and we help each other. We're connected at the roots. If you come to my church in Norway, you won't see a picture of Mark. You won't see a room named after him. But he's had an impact on me. That's had an impact on my church. Same thing with Vern in Buenos Aires. Same thing with Jakob in Hanoi and Dan in Phuket and Warren who's in Paris. We've been an encouragement to each other. We've helped each other in what God has called each of us to, because it's our tribe. We understand what we're dealing with. But we also know that we've got to follow God's voice uniquely for us and for our own churches. But the worst thing is when our churches are too afraid to step into what God has called us to. Because God has something great for this church. God knows what's coming, and God knows how He wants to position you. And I don't know. I have no idea what the vision is, something we haven't talked about, and where you guys are going. But I just want to encourage you in that. This quote by Paulo Coelho is one that I want to leave you with. He said, "The ship is safest when it is in port, but that's not what ships were built for." The same is true of the church. Sometimes it feels safest if we just build the wall and we just stay in. But God hasn't put our church here for that. God has put your church here to reach out and make an impact in Guatemala. So I encourage you, be mindful of the past. Let's be active today where God's calling us today. But let's also be focused on the future wherever God's taking you, so you're ready to embrace the next challenge, the next opportunity He has, so that you can see God's glory in a greater way, and so that your community can see it as well, and more can be drawn to Him. Let me pray, and then I'll close. God, we thank you so much for this church. I thank you for the people here. God, I thank you for what you are doing in Guatemala. I thank you that you have a plan, not only for the Union Church here, but also for Guatemala, for Guatemalans, and for the internationals who are here, for the diplomats, for the trailing spouses, for the business people, for those who are migrants. God, you have a plan for them. God, I pray for Mark and Megan. I pray for the other leaders here. Many I've had the pleasure of meeting this last few days. God, I pray that you would just be walking just in a mighty way with them, that you would be guiding them. We pray this church would have unity, Father, in the calling that you have on it, in the direction that you are calling it forward, Father. And we pray that we'll be rejoicing a year from now, and 5 years from now, and 10, in the mighty works that you have done through Union Church of Guatemala. We thank you for your love and for your grace, and the fact that you invite us into your work. You don't need us, but you invite us that we might be a part of what you are doing. We praise your name for that. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.